echo in a few. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session and this webinar on pivot tables made easy, data analysis with pivot tables, right? We'll be going from the very basics to a few advanced topics in pivot table, whatever we can cover in this 1 hour time. So I'll start my screen, share my screen and get started immediately. I'll first give a brief overview about the firm I work for, Havisham Consulting, and then I'll go ahead and start with the examples that I have created for all of you, right? We'll also look at the responses that we received from all of you for the challenges that I had asked, right? So we'll have a look at those as well before we jump to the examples. Great. So I hope my screen is visible to everyone. And in case throughout the session, anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them. You can put the questions in the chat, however you feel comfortable. Great. So guys, we are Havisham Consulting. We're an analytics firm that works in the area of digital transformation, data analytics, data visualization, business intelligence, process automation, and workflow architecture. The firm is founded by Mr. Havish Madhupati. I work with him in the capacity of a consultant in the area of analytics and data strategy. These are some of the key clients that we work with across sectors. So we've got clients like Bharat Petroleum, Sterlite Power, Renew, Ajio Power. In the CPG and healthcare space, we're actively working with Landmark and Diageo and DS Group and Metropolis as well at the current stage. In terms of government institutions, we do a lot of work with NSC Academy, right, and NABARD as well. Similarly, we've done a lot of work in BFSI and consulting as well. These are a few key recommendations that we've received over the years for the work we've done, both in training and in consulting, right? The work that we do has also been featured in different business magazines such as Analytics Insight, Business World, Economic Times, and Speakin'. What we do can essentially be categorized into 6 buckets. We help our clients improve their existing business models by writing more efficient formulas and improving the structure of the model. Then we create custom and complex reusable formulas and functions on Excel using the worksheet formulas that we have in Excel, using M code in Power Query, DAX in Power Pivot, or in Power BI, and using VBA as well. We also create dashboards, business dashboards for senior leadership and senior stakeholders and for general purpose across the organization, both on Tableau and on Power BI. Similarly, we also create relational models, connecting data sources from multiple, connected data from multiple sources, because like we know, data does not come from a single source of truth. And this is a very important step before you move to the data visualization of the data analysis side. Then we also create custom user forms for data entry and single view trackers. Now, if you see carefully, this is done on top of an Excel. So this is done using Visual Basic for application, the programming language in Excel. And this is completely customizable. This was for a client this was for the HR function. This is called a talent tracker, but we can create anything and everything that we want using VBA to view data, to analyze data, to create charts or engaging user forms in Excel itself. And we also create workflow architecture, document the business processes and SOPs, right? These are some snapshots from the workshops that we've done at Indian Oil, Arun Jaitley, National Institute of Financial Management, Bharat Petroleum, National Stock Exchange Mumbai, and NABARD, right? That's it. And I'll now directly start with the examples that I have prepared for you, right? So perfect. So make your data work for you, uncover insights, and streamline analysis with pivot tables. I'm assuming all of us have worked with pivot tables in some capacity, right? Because that is one of the foremost ways in Excel of how we learn to do data analysis. Even before we learn how to write complex formulas, we learn how to create pivot tables because it is essentially a drag and drop mechanism. And hence it's very intuitive and easy for a new user to learn and adapt quickly. Now, what you guys said in terms of the challenges that I asked, right, in the questionnaire that you guys have filled, the registration form. So a lot of you said that, you have issues with formatting and customizing pivot tables, managing large data sets efficiently, understanding pivot table calculations and formulas, difficulty in selecting the right data. So we'll be covering each and every one of these, right? In terms of external data sources, I will only be able to show you today connecting to a CSV file that is outside of your Excel, right? And refreshing the pivot table, sharing and collaborating, handling errors, and pivot charts. We'll be covering all of these, right? Now, why would you want to use a pivot table over using worksheet formulas, which are your Excel formulas, right? First is there is simplicity and speed, right? So pivot table allow you to summarize large amount of data very quickly, right? Without having to write complex formulas, without having to know how to write complex formulas and functions, right? Then there is a dynamic reporting. The entire worksheet formulas also help you create interactive reports. But with a pivot table, it goes to a completely new level and it becomes much more flexible and easy to create as well, right? Anytime the data source changes and you refresh the pivot table, the data gets automatically updated. You can do some great aggregations and calculations, some very complex ones in pivot table by simply doing a right click and choosing the aggregation or the calculation that you want. Whereas if you were to do this using Excel formulas or M code or Power Query, or DAX, it would have taken you a lot of time. Firstly, the learning curve would have been quite long, and to do it also would have been very complex if you're not aware of how to do it, right? They are able to give you a very quick visual representation, and there's a reduced risk of errors because when you manually write a formula, there's a chance that you might make an error. But with pivot tables, since you're directly taking data from the source, so there is less chance of you making errors, right? Now, I have a few more slides, but we'll not be focusing on them right now. So I have a data set here, a very simple sales data set, right? I have got order date, ship date, customer name, city, state, right? I've got my country, region, market, category, segment. So we've got three categories and we've got around 17 subcategories that we will be analyzing. We've got sales, quantity, discount, and profit. A very simple sales data set. Uh, Now the total rows in this are 51,291. Later on, we'll also be looking how to connect to a dataset which has more than 7 lakh rows, right? So first things first, let me expand the ribbon. Now, when you want to create a pivot table, you will not press Control A to select the entire dataset, or you will not select an individual column or an individual row. You will simply place your, now right now, if you have a look in Excel, we have, right now, I have not created a table, right? In Excel, we have a concept called table in which my data gets converted into a table. Right now, I just have a data set across multiple rows and columns. When I want to create a pivot table, I can go to insert at the left top corner. Once I'm at insert, I can go to pivot table and I can choose from table and range, right? The shortcut is fairly simple. Alt NVT. The shortcut to create a pivot table is Alt NVT and enter. This will create a pivot table on a new worksheet. Very quickly, one more time. Just click on any cell inside the dataset, press Alt NVT and press enter. This will give you your pivot table, right? Let me just delete the extra sheet that was created and we'll get started with working on the pivot table right now. I'll also keep myself at the bottom here, the video screen. Great. Now, when you create a pivot table for the first time, obviously at the top in the ribbon, you will have two new tabs, pivot table analyze and design. That'll only appear when you click inside the pivot table. As soon as I click outside the pivot table area, those tabs will disappear. I click back inside. On the right hand side, I have something called pivot table fields. Now this pivot table fields, now a very common feature that you can do here is when you have a large list of columns, it becomes very difficult to scroll, right? Or even if you want to drag and drop values, you either minimize this area to see all the columns, but then you have less space in the fields area below, right? So one option that you have here is if you click on the gear icon, just an update. So this is not going to be completely hands-on, right? Because we only have a short amount of time and we're going to do an entire refresher of pivot tables. But I will share the file with you. I'll share the PowerPoint with you and I'll share the recording with you. So you will have all the files on the recording and the PowerPoint as well. Resuming. So pivot table fields, and on the right hand side, you have this gear icon that allows you to change the layout of the pivot table field, right? So on the second one is the one that I like because I can get my columns on one side and on by fields on the other side. As soon as I click on the second option, which is field section and area section side by side, immediately I get a long list of my columns without having to scroll. And the dragging process, dragging and dropping also becomes much more easier and intuitive, right? Now that we have to create, now that we've figured out the layout, what we'll do is we'll add a very simple metric. So let's add my market in the rows. As soon as I add my, let me zoom in as well. As soon as I add my market to the rows, it automatically, populates that. And along with my market, I can also have my sales in the values. Now, when I add sales to values, by default, you will see that the aggregation is going to be a sum. Why? Because pivot table is smart enough, Excel is smart enough to understand that this column, the sales column, has only values, numbers, right? Similarly, if I were to drag maybe a segment in values, by default, the aggregation is going to be a count. By default, the aggregation is going to be a count. Why a count? Because for a text value, it cannot do a sum, and hence by default, it is going to do a count, right? Now, once you have the pivot table, let's say some simple summary like this. If you were to do this exact thing here, if you were to do the exact analysis that we just did over here using this table, what you would have to do is you would have to first get a unique list of the markets. So I would use the unique function to get a unique list of the markets, right? Once I have that, then I would go ahead and do a sum if. I would go ahead and do a sum if, where I would say that my range for the sum if is going to be column H, my criteria is going to be this, and my sum range is going to be this. And I close my bracket. And when I press enter, that is when I get the correct result. So multiple steps, knowing how to write multiple formulas, right? That is how you would have to do this. And if you see, the results are exactly the same. Let me just go back and remove this, right? So pivot table allows you to, without having to know, without, now unique is a function that is available in the latest versions. So someone who's on a previous version or any version earlier than Microsoft 2021 would not have unique as a feature, right? So great. Now that we have a simple pivot table, what happens is once you've created a pivot table, right? Let's say we just saw market. If I add my subcategory to my rows, right? So I get subcategory by sales. Now, when you want to format the numbers, right? I don't want to see decimal values. When you right click, there are two options that you see. You see format cells and number format, right? Format cell is going to only format this individual cell. You have to click on number format. When I click on number format, the format cells dialog box opens up. Another way to open this is I can highlight the area that I want to format and I can press Control 1. I can press Control 1. That would also open the format cells dialog box. Now here's very simply, if I do not want the decimals, I can go to number. I can reduce the decimal spaces from here. I can use a thousand separator to add a comma and press OK. And that is how you format your numbers. That is how you format your numbers. Now, again, if I want to sort my data, what I can do is I can do right click. I can go to sort and I can do smallest to largest or largest to smallest. If I just do a largest to smallest, my data gets sorted in a descending order. Now, if I have to go ahead and choose the top 3 subcategories or the top 5 subcategories out of all of these, right? Let's say I want to report here where I want to see my top 5 subcategories, right? So I'm going to click on this drop down here for the row field. I'm going to click on this drop down here for the row field. Before I show you that, let me just disable one setting because I want to show you guys something very quickly. Data and okay. Let me just create a new pivot table. Let me just create a new pivot table. Pivot table shortcut Alt and VT enter. Alt and VT enter is allow me to create a new pivot table. I'm going to add subcategory and sales. Now I'll tell you why I created a new pivot table. So right now the heading subcategory does not appear here by default. How does it appear? If I go to the very top in my design tab, I go to the very top in the design tab and I come back and change this to tabular format. If I change this to tabular format, that is when the column heading appears, right? But then I don't want to do this every time. Typically, every time you're making a pivot table, the right structure is going to be tabular form, right? You would not want a compact or an outline. You would always want a tabular form. So how do you enable this by default for all the pivot tables that you create? Right? Let me just delete this sheet because we don't need that. We have a one here. So you will go to file, right? You will go to file, then you will go to options at the bottom here. You will go to options. And once you're in options, let me zoom in a bit, right? You will go to data and in data, make changes to default layout of pivot tables. You will choose this, right? And here, one option is, we just want to change the last one. We just want to change the last one, which is show in tabular form. You have some other options as well that if you want to turn off grand totals by default, if you want to turn off row totals by default, you can have that as turned on and turned off as well, right? What I will do is I will just press OK and I'll come back and I'll press OK. So now when I create a new pivot table every time, if I just remove subcategory and add subcategory, the heading is going to be there, right? It is not going to show me row label, which it does by default when you do not have a tabular form. Great. So we looked at sorting. We looked at changing the column heading from row field to a actual field name, right? Now what I'm going to do is we were looking at our top 3 or top 10 subcategories, top 5 subcategories. So we have to click on this drop down here for the first column, right? And in the value filter at the very bottom, you have an option called top 10. In the value filter at the very bottom, you have an option called top 10. As soon as you click on that, let's say I want to look at my top 5 subcategories out of the 17 that I have. I want to do it by items, and I want to do a sum of sales because that is the only value that I have in my field. That is the only value that I have in my value section, value field. I press OK, and this is going to give me the top five subcategories across regions, across the entire data set. I have not applied a filter. Remember, this is basis the complete data set. I have not applied a filter for a region, a market, or a specific customer segment. I'm going to copy this pivot table. I'm going to paste it right here. Right now, when you copy and paste a pivot table, it retains the pivot table. It does not just paste the data. The entire pivot table gets pasted, right? And now here, what I'm going to do is similarly here, rather than having a top n, in the top n box, you also have the option to show bottom five. You also have the option to show bottom five. I'm going to press OK, and immediately you are able to analyze your top five and bottom five subcategories in a single click. What I can do further is I can go ahead and add a filter. I can go ahead and add a filter to this data set. Let's say I want to add a filter by my markets. So I will drag filter. I'll drag markets to my filter. I'll drag markets to my filter, and it'll appear here at the very top. Any filters that you add appear in the first row. And if I keep on adding filters for from different columns, they keep on adding one below the other, right? Right now, I just want to filter for my market. Right now, I just want to filter for my market. I'll just Control Z a few times, press OK. And if I select a specific market, my data will get filtered automatically. My data will get filtered automatically, right? But you can see that both of the pivot tables are not getting updated. Both these pivot tables are not getting updated because a filter can interact with only one pivot table at a time. A filter can interact with only one pivot table at a time. So what can you do to interact with multiple pivot tables at the same time, right? I was going to cover this a little later, but that's fine. I'll show it right now. So you also have the option in pivot tables to add a slicer. You also have the option to add a slicer. Now, a slicer can be added from pivot table analyze, the pivot table analyze button, and go to insert slicer. Before I do that, what I'm going to do very quickly is I'm going to go give both of these pivot tables a name, right? I'm going to give both of these pivot tables a name so that after some time when we have multiple pivot tables created, we don't have any confusion. How do you give your pivot table a name? Right click, pivot table options, right click, pivot table options, and this pivot table option box opens up, and very quickly you can just choose to give it a name. Say top n subcategories. I'm going to copy this and press OK. Right click on the next one, pivot table options, and I'm going to say bottom n subcategories, right? Press OK. Great. Now, selecting any of these pivot tables will not make a difference. I will go to pivot table analyze and I will go to insert. Now, once I am on insert, I'll press insert. And here I want to add a filter or a slicer rather than not a filter. I want to add a slicer for my market, right? Now, I don't require this anymore. I don't require the filter that we added at the top anymore. I am going to remove that, right? And as soon as I remove that, you will see, and also let me turn off grid lines so that we have a neat and clean view over here. Great. Let me minimize this a bit. Perfect, right? Now, when I choose a slicer again, only one of the pivot tables is getting updated. What I can do very quickly is when you click on the slicer, a new tab appears at the top called slicer, right? You can go to that tab called slicer, then come back and you can change your slicer. You can give it a specific name, market slicer. And what we want to do is we want to go to this option called report connections. We want to go to this option called report connections. What this allows you to do is you can manage which pivot tables the slicer is connected to, right? So you can have one slicer connected to multiple pivot tables. You can have one slicer connected to multiple pivot tables on the same sheet and on different sheets as well. On the same sheet and on different sheets as well. I'm going to click report connection. I have this dialog box will open up. I have two pivot tables. As you can see, we had given both of these names. Right now, I can see that the slicer is only interacting with the top n subcategories pivot. I can also choose or have the slicer interact with as many pivots as I have. Right now, we just have two since we just started the session. And we can have the pivot table interact with the other, we can have the slicer interact with the other pivot table as well. And pivot charts. So select pivot table or pivot charts. So a slicer can interact with a pivot chart or a pivot table as well. And I'll just press OK. As soon as I press OK and I filter for a specific region, in that region, both of these tables get updated, and I'm able to see the top n and the bottom n subcategories in both the pivot tables. Now with slicer, you have to be a little careful. By default, slicer allows selecting one value at a time. By default, slicer allows selecting one value at a time. When you click on this funnel option, it'll clear your selection. And let's say you want to select multiple values, you can go ahead and choose the first option. This would allow you to keep or select or deselect multiple values, right? This would allow you to select or deselect multiple values. So if I just want to look at Asia Pacific and Africa, right, I can have a look at them together. If I want to look at only LATAM and USCA, which is United States and Canada, I can do that as well. If I want to look at only Europe, I can do that as well. What we're going to do is we're going to go one step ahead. I'm going to click inside this pivot table and I'm going to insert a chart. A very simple, let's say, let's add a pie. Let's add a pie. We don't have a lot of slices here, so let's add a pie. And let me minimize that. Let me put it here. Let me also zoom out a bit. I don't need the pivot tables field, so I can close them from here, right? The pivot table field, the other advantage is you can hover your mouse to the top of the pivot table field and you can drag it anywhere you want. You can drag it. It is not fixed in that position. You can drag it outside as well. You can place it anywhere you want, right? You can place it anywhere you want. If you go to pivot table analyze, you have the option turn on and turn off field list. Basically hide and unhide field list. Hide and unhide field list. And if you just drag it here, it comes back to the default position, right? But we don't need that right now. So we'll turn it off. Great. We'll turn it off. And we have one pivot table, right? We have one pivot table here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have the legends moved to the bottom so that we have some space on the right. And the legends, I'm also going to decrease the size. We don't want such a large size. And I'm going to remove this. I'm going to hide all the value and the field buttons, right, from the chart. And here I'm going to add a title at the top. Let's say top N subcategories, right? Top N subcategories. And I'm going to press enter. Now, in the chart title, rather than having to manually type the title, I'll select the chart title. How do I know to select it? Do you see the four border that are appearing, the four blue circles that appear besides the chart area? Then I'll go ahead and I'll click in the formula bar. I'll write equal to, and I'll select the cell where my title is. I'll select the cell where my title is, and voila. In one single click, you've made your chart title dynamic. In one single click, you've made your chart title dynamic. You can make it bold and you can change the color. You want to make it something else, you can go ahead and do that as well, right? You can go ahead and do that as well. Now, right now, since I've created this pivot table, this chart using this pivot table, and this pivot table is interacting with the slicer, it is able to also interact with the chart as well. I'll also go ahead and add my data labels. And we'll decrease the size of the data labels. So all of them come in a single line. Great. Right. And let's turn off multi-select. Okay, let's have it only for Africa. Similarly here, you can have bottom and subcategories, right? And you could create another chart here, right? I could go ahead and simply go to insert, pie chart. Let's say I want a donut chart this time. I want to move my legends to the bottom. I want to click on those and reduce the size, right? I want to turn on my data labels. I want to then right click and hide all field buttons. I want to move this here. I want to reduce the size. I want to click on the chart title, press equal to, click in the formula bar, then press equal to, and select the cell from where you want the chart title to be picked up. Make it bold. You can change the color. Changing the color of the cell is not going to change the color of the chart title. To change the color of the chart title, you will have to click on the chart title and then do the formatting that you want. And the formula bar, you see the address as well. So you could go ahead, change the location of the title. You could have the title dynamic, anything and everything that you want, right? This is the first example. Similarly, right click and pivot chart options. You can give pivot charts name as well. You can give the pivot charts name as well, right? If you look at the options at the top, if you go to format, at the top, you will have the pivot table names and options as well, right? Great. Now let's come back to the original data. Let's insert another pivot table, right? I can say Alt N V T enter. Alt N V T enter allows me to create a new pivot table using the shortcuts, right? Let me see what else I want to show you. Okay, before we move ahead with the examples, what I also want to show you is that there is a concept called pivot table cache. So it is nothing but every time you create a new pivot table from a single data source, Microsoft is storing a single cache, creating it for the very first time. So that cache is unique, common across all the pivot tables that you create. So if I create a specific calculation or a specific grouping, that will persist across all the pivot tables. So in a few minutes, we'll also see how we can create a new pivot table with a new pivot table cache, right? So when you create a pivot table in Excel, the pivot table cache stores a copy of the source data. This allows Excel to quickly analyze and manipulate the data without directly affecting the original data source. So any calculation that you add, any new column that you add in a pivot table, any new grouping that you do in a pivot table will not happen in the main data source. It will only happen in the pivot table cache. What benefits does it provide in terms of performance? It allows you to quickly generate pivot tables, even in large data sets. It allows independence because you're not changing anything in the original data source. The original data source remains intact, and it allows you to do an offline analysis whenever you're not connected to the original data source as well, right? We've seen the edit default option, right? Let's come back. And what I want to show is, okay, so come to the right. Let's rename the sheet very quickly. PT1, pivot table 1. Let's rename the other sheet. Right click, rename PT2. Okay. I will zoom in a bit and let's say I want to create a new pivot table. I'll have my field list over here as well. And let's say I want to look at my segments. I want to look at my segments, the customer segments, and the categories, and the categories. And I want to look at the total sales, right? I want to look at the total sales. Now, again, very quickly, formatting, control 1, number, right? And reduce decimal place, add the comma separator, and you get a neat and clean look, right? Now, when you create a pivot table like this is called a cross-tabulated report. This is called a cross-tabulated report. I have an example already prepared for you, which is this one, right? It is a cross-tabulated report essentially means where there is a relationship between the row and the columns. Whatever analysis you want to do, whatever outcome you want to get, will be at the intersection of the row and the column. This is like a condition, like a condition. So if I want to look at the how much sales I have in the technology category for the in the technology category for the corporate segment, I have 14,71,717,791. This is a cross-tabulated report, a cross-tabulated report. You have a similar concept in Python as well. I've gone ahead and taken the liberty of taking this screenshot. So in Python also, the idea is to show this to you that there is a different tool where you can do the exact same thing. The idea is not to overwhelm you or not to teach you Python right now, but the idea that the concept that you learn in Excel are transferable skills or transferable knowledge that you can implement across other tools. Obviously, the syntax and everything else is going to differ, but conceptually, it is the exact same thing. So in Python as well, you can create a cross-tab report typically using libraries such as pandas, numpy. With Python, you have more control and flexibility in manipulating and analyzing data, right? So if you have a look at this is the code, and very simply, I have multiple line items, multiple rows for laptop, 1, 2, 3. For phone, I have multiple rows, and for tablet, I have multiple rows. But when I go ahead and do a pivot in Python, I get a similar view like I would get in a Excel Excel pivot table, right? I get a similar view, right? So this is called a cross-tabulated report. This is called a cross-tabulated report, wherein you're looking at the columns and the rows to analyze the data, wherein you're looking at the columns and the rows to analyze the data. Let's go ahead and come to the next data set that we have, which is an extract from the original data set that we just saw. This data set is an extract from the original data set that we just saw. Before that, very quickly, if I come to this area, and let me just add a few more rows here because I want to show you something with relevant to pivot table design. I want to show you something relevant to pivot table design, right? Let me add my subcategory and okay, great. What I'm going to show is that by default in a pivot table, before we copy the pivot table to our PowerPoints, we do a lot of formatting, a lot of design, and we do it every time, right? So when you come to design, you have some options available over here, but they're not very neat. They're not very sophisticated. If you like them, you can go ahead and use them. What I like to do is I like to create a new pivot table style. I like to create a new pivot table style. I can click on this option under design. So design, pivot table styles group, click on the drop down, scroll down, and click on pivot table analyze, a pivot table style. Now here I can go ahead and give the style a name. I can say that PT underscore my style. I can give it any name that I want, right? Something that I can remember by easily. And I can go ahead and say that what element of the pivot table do I want to format? Do I want to set the design for? So I have multiple elements here. I have the whole table, report filter, right? I'll go ahead with the header row for now. I'll go ahead with the header row for now. I'll click on format and I'll go ahead and fill. I want a dark blue fill. and I can come back to font, and let's say I want a white font, right? And I want to make the headers bold as well. I want to make the headers bold as well. And I press OK, and I press OK. And by default, the design is not going to be applied. You will have to come back again. You'll have to come back again and click on the first option, my style, pt underscore my style. Click on that, and this gets enabled for your pivot tables. Similarly, I can go ahead and, sorry, I clicked on the other one. I can come back to the style that I just created. I can right click. I can say modify. Let's say I want to add some design or some style for my grand totals as well. So I can scroll down. I want to add a formatting from my grand total row. I will first choose the element, then go ahead and choose the formatting style that I want. Let's say I want a double underline to show the totals. I want to make it bold. And let's say I want to have it in a yellow color, right? And let's say I want the font to be black, right? And I press OK, and I press OK. Again, now it is going to be applied by default because I modified an existing style. Now, let's say every time I create a pivot table, do I have to go back and choose this style again and again? No, you don't have to. You can right click, and you can say set as default, set as default. As soon as you do that, now if I just click outside, I just copy this pivot table. Let's say I insert a new pivot table. So come back, Alt and VT, and I want to select on the existing worksheet, which is PT2. I want to add a pivot table here. Go ahead, add a pivot table. I have my pivot table fields here. Let's say I add a pivot table for my region. I have a lot of regions. I have around, I mean, we've got 23 regions, and let's say I just add region level sales, and you will see that the pivot table design is automatically created, right? You don't have to do it again and again. One design style consistently applied across all the pivot tables in your worksheet. Very quickly, let me have a look at the chat as well. If there's anything, absolutely not. Great. In case anyone has any questions, you can ask me to stop. If you want me to repeat a topic, do let me know that as well. Great. Now we will move ahead and we'll look at how we can group and summarize data by adding calculations in a pivot table, right? I hope so far we've done the very basics. I hope you were able to learn a few tips and tricks here and there, right? Now I want to show you something even more cooler. So I'll come to this extract of the data set, right? And let's say whatever pivot table I create, I'll create over here itself so that it's easier for us to follow through. It's easier for us to follow through, right? And before that, one very quick thing. Now, in this case, how do I decide what sorting order do I want to apply? When I do a right click, I go to sort, I say largest to smallest, it is going to sort by my grand total. Right click, sort, largest to smallest, it is going to sort by the corporate or the office segment. Another way to do this is you can click on the drop down here in the first field, and you can go to more sort options, right? Now here you have the ability in sort dialog box to choose what you want to sort by. So let's say I want to sort by the sum of sales or by the subcategory, and I can sort in an ascending or a descending order, and that sort option gets applied across the pivot table. That sort option gets applied across the pivot table. Perfect. Now, in pivot table, you have the option or the ability to group dates, to group numbers, right? To create bins, logical groupings, basically, for your numbers or your dates, right? For your numbers or your dates. Similarly, you also have the ability to perform a calculation or create a calculated field as well. We'll have a look at that. But first, let's have a look at group. So very quickly, Alt N VT. I will not press enter because I don't want to create it on new worksheet, right? I will, I want it on an existing worksheet. Let's say I want a pivot table right here, and we'll have it on the same worksheet on which we have the data set. Now, like all of us do, if I want to group dates, I will drag my dates to my rows. Now, when I drag my dates to my rows, in the newer versions, it is supposed to group by default. In the newer versions, the dates will group into year, month, quarter, basis whatever granularity you have available in your data, right? Days, month, quarter, and year. Now, when I right click, I have the option to choose group, but it says that I cannot group this selection. It says that I cannot group this selection. Can anybody try to tell me why? I have a simple data set here. I have multiple dates. I'm trying to group the selection. Why is Excel not allowing me to group this selection? Can anyone give it a try? In case you've worked with grouping of dates, you can unmute or you can put it in the chat as well, however you feel you're comfortable. When I right click and when I say group, why doesn't Excel allow me to group? Text, exactly. So absolutely right, Ganesh. So in my data set, I have not all values are originally dates. Not all values are dates, right? What I'm going to do is I'll quickly convert any value that is not a date into a date. Now, date essentially in Excel are numbers. So if I press the shortcut control, if I just change this from date to a number, 43,477, right? In Excel, any date is essentially stored as a number. So to convert this into a number, or any date that is a text into a number, I'll simply do a simple aggregation, simple multiplication into 1, right? And let me do that across the entire column because I have, right? And as soon as I do that, my entire data set will, or the date column, all the values will get converted to date. I can now, using a very simple option, I can use my right mouse click, drag this over here. And as I paste it, it asks me, do I want to copy here as values only? I will do that. And my pivot table has still not gotten updated. Even if I add it now, what I will need to do is I'll need to do right click and refresh. And now if I right click and go to group, it'll allow me to group my data, which it is not doing, which is funny. Let's have a look one more time. Refresh, right click and group. Okay, let us quickly check what the issue is. Control C, Control Alt V, paste as value, Control Shift 3 to convert everything to date. And let us copy all these values. Control backspace to come back up. Let us copy and paste them right here and copy here as values. Very quickly, let us check if everything is a date. Okay, we have one value that has not been converted into date for some reason. Control Shift 3 and let's come back and do it on the entire column. Right click, refresh, remove order date. Let's create a new pivot table very quickly. Alt NVT, existing sheet. Let's add it right here. And if I put my date in rows, and it is automatically getting grouped, right? Refresh works typically. Not sure why it was not working right now, but refresh, right click and refresh would work. It not happen automatically. Either you delete or create a new pivot table, or the ideal approach is you click refresh. What I meant by grouping is this is what would happen, right? In the newer versions, pivot table will group dates automatically. If I right click and I click on ungroup, this is the default. Right click on group. Now, when you click on group, it'll ask you how you want to group the data. It is going to select the minimum and the maximum dates. Let's say you want to have month, quarter, year, whatever granularity you have on your data. If you have date and time in the same column, you can go ahead and choose that as well. Right now I have days, months, quarters, and years. I don't have weeks in this case, right? But I can go ahead and I can choose days. I can go ahead and I can choose dates, days, and I can say the number of periods that I want is 7, right? And it'll create a weekly grouping for me, right? It'll create a weekly grouping for me. And then I can go ahead and look at my sales in this specific days interval that I created. So I simply went ahead, I right click and I went to days and I kept the number of days as 7 to have a weekly data set, Now let me scroll towards the right and create a new pivot table. We don't need this column anymore. Okay, let me also make some space here. Alt NVT, and I want to add a pivot table right next to this. Press OK, right? Now I want to show you grouping of numbers. Let me zoom in, right? Scroll towards the right. Perfect. Now, let's say I want to group sales, right? Let's say I want to group sales and quantity. I'll show you what the difference is going to be, right? Now, to group sales, I cannot add it in values because when I put a number in values, without anything in rows or columns, the Excel's pivot table is automatically going to aggregate it, right? So I will have to add it to rows. Any value field that I want to create a group out of, I will have to add it to rows first. Now, when I right click on this and I say group, right? Now, this is going to give me a grouping. It's going to pick up the default. So it's going to say starting at 8.68. Let's say I want to start this at 8 and 25 to 23. So let's say 2600, right? And I want intervals of 100, okay? And I can go ahead and press OK. And this will create the grouping for me. And I can go ahead and I can add the sales amount here. So I can see what is the sales amount across. Let me scroll towards the right. I can see what the sales amount is across my different buckets that I created. But now there is also not proper documentation on this. So the 108, so 8 is the lower limit, 108 is the upper limit. Now is the 108 included in the first row or in the second row? Right? It is not included in the first row by default. it is included in the served row. So in any of these rows, the upper limit is not included by default. But when you create a pivot table grouping out of decimal values, it is going to have the upper limit and the lower limit of the next row same, right? Now, when I go ahead and create a pivot table, I'm going to create one more pivot table. So this is out of my sales value. I'm going to create one more pivot table out of my quantity, which are integer values, which are not decimal values. I'll go ahead, Alt and VT. I will choose existing sheet, come towards the right, create a pivot table right here, press OK, move to the right. Okay. Now again, quantity to the rows, not to the values. Right click, group, right? Starting at 1 to 36, press, let's make it 40 and let's start it at 0, right? Press OK, right? It is going to create the grouping. Now, when you group integers, not decimal values, integers, whole numbers, the grouping is going to be a little different compared to when you group decimals, right? The upper limit and the lower limit are going to be different, which is very easy for you to identify that these are, also let me add the count of values here, right? Let me add the values here, right? So again, if you want to change the column heading in any of these cases, if you want to change the column heading, I just want to say frequency, or let's say count, let's say count. I can go ahead and do that as well. I can go ahead and change that as well. Now, in this pivot table, where the grouping is not very accurate, the grouping has been done correctly. The upper limit is not included in the first row, or any of the upper limits are not included in any of the rows, right? But it is visually a little confusing. So there are a few methods that you can do. In the heading itself, you can specify that upper limit not included, upper limit not included, right? You can specify that, and you can very quickly just wrap this so that it is visible this way, right? Or what else you can do is you can select the entire column, right? Press Control H, and once you're in the find and replace, I want to select the delimiter, which is my dash, and I will replace it with up to, and I want to do a replace all, and okay, close. Now this is much more descriptive, much more easy to understand, because earlier, right now it is very clear that the grouping is up to 108, not inclusive of 108, right? Not inclusive of 108, right? So this is with reference to grouping of dates, grouping of decimals, and grouping of integers, right? Grouping of dates, decimals, and integers. Now, let's move on to the next example that I have for you guys. Okay, let's come to the survey data. Now, the survey data that I want to analyze is the data set that you guys have responded on, right? Now, this data is not represented very accurately. This data is not represented very accurately because in the survey results, if I just go back to Chrome, you guys, when you chose multiple options, right? Now, in the Google form, those options are combined with a delimiter, right? One besides the other. So if someone chose 10 options, right, or 10 challenges, all of them come in a single row. All of them come in a single row. So before I take this data to the pivot table, take this data to the pivot table, I'll have to clean this data. So very quickly, what I'll do is I'll go to data and I'll go to from table and range. Now this is going to open up Power Query, right? This is going to open up Power Query, and just give me 1 second. Let me just connect my charger. Okay, great. And as soon as Power Query opens up, I want to do a very basic data cleaning here. Let me just zoom in. So since I have multiple comments, right? Multiple comments separated by delimiters, I would want to split my columns by delimiters. But before that, I want to do a simple cleaning. I want to do a replace values because I have a lot of full stops or a comma and space, right? That I don't require, right? So I can go ahead and replace that value because after the last comment, I only have a full stop, right? So I'm going to replace those, and then I'm going to do a split column by delimiter. My delimiter is going to be a full stop in this case, right? It's not going to be a space, custom, and a full stop, right? And I press OK, right? And again, everything is in multiple columns. I would want to add an index column. right? I would want to add an index column here because when I unpivot this data, where is column, right? Because when I unpivot this data, I want it to be at the very, I want the index column to be at the very beginning, because then I can go ahead and very simply, let me move it from here to the very top. Just give me a second and paste and check the box. Okay. So now that I have the index column at the very beginning, right click and unpivot other columns, right? Now I have my question here and I have the responses here. I have my question here and I have the responses here. I have the responses here. Now very quickly, I can just come back and wherever I have a lot of blank values, I will not need those columns. I'll uncheck those and I'll say close and load to, close and load to. Now I will not directly load this pivot table as a table, but I will load it as a pivot table report, in a new worksheet. So in that case, what happens is whatever transformation I did, those transformations remain inside of Power Query, they did not come here. So I can very simply put the responses in rows and I can go ahead, put the responses in values and I can put the responses again in values. I can do a right click and I can say that I want to see the values as a percentage of column total. As a percentage of column total, I will go ahead in the first option, go to sort, and I want to sort by a descending order of the count of responses 2, which is my grand total. And I get a very neat pivot table report that tells me what are the responses that the participants have given before they joined or while they were registering for the session. This is how you can analyze survey data as well when you have only a single column. When you have only a single column, right? When you have only a single column. Great. Now, since we had to unpivot it, I had to add that index column. But if you don't want to do that, you can go ahead and not do that as well, right? Now, here I want to connect to a data set. Here I want to connect to a data set that has 7 lakh rows. But I will not obviously open that CSV file because it's going to take some time to open that. What I'll do is now when you're working with pivot tables and you have a large data set and you do not want to open that data set, right? I will go to data. I want to connect to a text or CSV file. So I'll choose text or CSV and very quickly I'll just come back and choose that file, right? This is data for some companies, their websites, their LinkedIn, all those information, right? And now I'm loading this to Power Query because I do not want to open this directly in Excel. Power Query will be able to open this very easily. This is a CSV file. The delimiter is a comma. I click on transform data. And now very quickly, just to give you an overview of how many rows we are working with, I will come to the first option, transform, and click on count rows. And you will very quickly be able to see that the total count of rows in this data set is approximately 7 lakh and I think 7,17,000 something, right? This will take a few seconds, right, while this is happening. And so we have 7 lakh 70,000, so 70 lakh 71 lakh 73,439. It's not 7 lakh 71 lakh 73,439. Now you would have never been able to open this in an Excel, right? But you're able to do this in Power Query in a single click. I'll remove that last entry. Now, very quickly, I want to load this data back to Excel, but obviously the entire data set cannot come in Excel, right? The entire data set cannot come in Excel. Excel has a 10 lakh limit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on close and load to, close and load to, and here very smartly, rather than choosing table, because I cannot get the entire table here, I will choose pivot table report. I will choose pivot table report. I'll press OK. And as soon as I do that, this will take a few seconds to load. This will take a few seconds to load. Right? So while this is loading, let me show you another example. While this is loading, let me show you another example, right? Because too many rows, but not sure why the download failed. Okay, not an issue, but that is the process. That is the process of how you would do it, right? That is the process of how you would do it. Very quickly, I would like to come back to the original data set and create a new pivot table. I want to show you guys some calculations. I want to show you guys some calculations that we can do, right? So let's say I put my order date in rows. I put my order date in rows and I only want to look at my month and year. I only want to look at my month and year. I will only expand the first two. I will only expand the first two. I will minimize this a bit. Great. And Besides this, I will go ahead and add my sales and values. I will go ahead and add my sales and values. Very quickly, I will format the sales value. Current, I'll make it a number, no decimal, and okay. Add the comma separator as 1,000. Let me also turn off the grid lines. Great. Now I can add multiple calculations to this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add sales multiple times. I'm going to go ahead and add sales multiple times. So what I want to do is first I want to look at a column total. So first I will, right now it is a sum. I'll go ahead and make it a percent of column total. So across the entire column, it tells me what the total is. Now here in the design, I also want to look at the subtotal. So very quickly in the design option, I will go ahead and right click, modify, and choose my subtotal 1 format. And let's make that also yellow, right? And let's make it a different color. And let's make the font black. And let's have a single underline, press OK, OK. And that did not happen. 1 second. Let me just check if it was subtotal 1 or, oh, sorry, that was subtotal column. I have to choose subtotal row, not subtotal column. That's my bad, not an issue. Let's come back, quickly format it. Let's add a single underline, press OK, press OK. Right, great. We have a color for a subtotal as well, right? Very quickly, just one last thing. I want to make it bold as well. Perfect, okay. Now, this column is a percent of column total. So the last value will add up to 100 across all the years, right? In the next column, what I want to do is I want to look at show values as, but a percent of, let's say my parent row total, percent of parent, no, not a parent row total. That's going to give me the same result. Show, firstly, I want to do it as a sum, right click, show values as, okay, I want to do a difference from. I want a difference from the previous month. So I want to look at my months, but I want to subtract from the previous. I want to subtract from the previous. I'm going to press OK. Now this is going to give me a calculation. This is going to give me a calculation that is going to be a difference from the months, month on month. This is the month on month difference that I can see, the month on month difference that I can see over here, right? So for any of the 2 months, I can see a month on month difference. Let me do these in separate pivot tables very quickly. Let me do these in separate pivot tables. Let me just copy this and paste it here, right? And here I want to do a percent of column total. Not sure why that disappeared. Let's bring that back. Right click, show value as percent of column total. Right, great. Now here, what I want to do is I'll drag out sales. I'll bring back sales again. Right click and show values as difference from, and I'll choose previous. So it'll give me a difference from the previous month, right? Now I can go ahead and I can also, right here it is showing in NA because I've not expanded. I'm looking at a month level. When I expand, it'll show me the correct results. When I expand, it'll show me the correct results, right? When I go ahead and add another value for sales, right click, and I can also look at the percentage difference from, rather than just the difference from in actual values. I can look at the percentage difference from, and I see the correct result. I see the correct results. Now, another thing that you can do here is in terms of custom formatting, you can go ahead and select the data set, press Control 1, come to custom, and in custom, I can go ahead and choose that, let's say wherever there is a negative value, let's say I want to show that in red color. I want to show that in red color. So I'll come to custom format and make this custom format. And let's say along with the red color, I want to add a arrow. I want to add a symbol, right? I want to add a symbol. I'll add that as well. And I'll press space. Okay. So wherever there's a negative value, that will be highlighted in red. This is like conditional formatting, but this is a custom format. Similarly, I can go ahead and I can have a similar value for green as well, for the positive values as well, right? I can say positive. I can add the up arrow symbol, right? I can add the up arrow symbol and I can go ahead and say 0.00% and press OK. And I will have the positive values as well. I will have the positive values in green and the negative values in red. The positive values in green and the negative values in red, right? Let us come back and see if that data set is loaded. Not very sure why it is not loading. And let me just quickly check. Close and load. This is going to only create a connection. Load to pivot table report. Okay. And let's quickly see if we're able to load that. Oh, I think it's getting loaded. Oh, there are a few errors in the dataset that we would have had to clean, which we've not done. So let me stop that. Let me stop that. Let's not go ahead with that because we'll have to clean the dataset in Power Query and we are short on time. So we'll not be doing that right now. But that's the process of how you would do it. That is the process of how you would go ahead and load a dataset that has multiple rows that you cannot store in Excel or open in Excel, but you can connect it externally in a new Excel file using Power Query and then load it as a pivot table report and then load it as a pivot table report, right? What else do I want to show you? 1 second. Okay, let's come to the original data set, Alt NVT, enter, right? And say I want to put my sales and my values, subcategory in my rows, right? Sales in my values, subcategory in my rows. I want to add the sales again, right? I can also look at a running total. I can also look at the running total. Let me do that at the month level itself. So in the example where I was showing you months, which was sheet, this one, right? Yes, Ganesh.
In that you have shown that we have to load as a pivot table report,
Yes.
or we have to load as a only create a connection.
No, if you create a connection, then you won't be able to do anything with the data set. It just keeps a connection on the right hand side. You will
Okay.
have to make a pivot table report. That is when it will allow you to create a pivot table report. So for
And
example,
if
yeah,
we want to append means like now you have big one file like what you have shown, but
right.
if we want to append another year data set to that existing data, then how
Yes.
the things can be.
Let me show you that example right now. And let me just open the file. Just give me 1 second. So documentation, new folders, clients, raw, Power BI, sales historical. So I have 3 year sales over here, something like this. You have 3 Excel files.
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, I'll just copy the folder path. Right, I'll come back to Excel. I'll go to data, and from data I'll go to get data, from file and from folder. Right, I'll choose from folder. When I do that, I'll put in my folder path here, and now I don't see anything here because it is going to pick all the files from my data set from my folder. It's
Yes,
going to create a connection to that folder path, and it's going to show me all the files, right? Now, if my column headings are exactly the same, irrespective of the order of the columns, but the case sensitivity is exactly the same, the spellings are exactly the same, I can very simply go ahead and click on combine and transform. When I click on combine and transform, you'll see that the data for 3 years, which is in 3 separate Excel files, will get loaded directly in Power Query, right? And from there, we can load it to Excel, right? And Power Query is exactly the same like in Excel. You would have it in Power BI as well. I'll choose the sample file, I'll press OK, and then I will go ahead and wait for Power Query to open. I'll go ahead and wait for Power Query to open, right? This might take a few seconds. Okay, great. Now, once Power Query is open, what I can simply do is I can do a quick check. I can do a quick check to see if my data has actually been loaded. So I can see that the data has actually been loaded. I'll have data for 3 years over here. So 11, 12, 13. I can simply come close and load to. And here, rather than choosing only create a connection, I'll choose pivot table report and I click OK. And it should give me a pivot table report here in a few seconds. This also has quite a few rows, I think around 60, 70,000 rows this way. So your data, the sales historical data, the data combined for 3 years is not going to be in the Excel, it's going to be in Power Query, but only the pivot table report is loaded here. Only the pivot table report is loaded here. Only the pivot table report is loaded here, right? And you can
Thank
go
you.
ahead and do whatever calculation you want to do
Yes.
on this, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
A-
One last thing I
And
want to show you. Yeah,
what is the use of this report connection? That is connections only. What is how we can use
the
that?
slicer one.
Not pivot table report. There is a connection only. Is the one option is there? Na only the data connection only. While
Oh,
loading the
only,
data
acha,
of
acha, while
3 years.
loading. No, no,
Yes.
it's just, it doesn't do anything. That option just allows, for example, if I come back to sales historical and I go to my queries and I say that I want sales historical load to only create connection. So that will remove the data from the Excel. It deletes the data from the Excel. It stores the data only in Power Query. You will not be
Okay.
able to see the data inside Excel, right? You'll not be able to see the data inside Excel, right?
But we can't operate
No, no,
on
no, not in Excel. Unless you load it to a pivot table report or to a table or to a pivot table chart, you can't do anything with it. Right?
Okay, fine,
Till
fine.
that it is only a connection. If I right click and I choose load to and I say pivot table report, then I can work with it. Else I can't. Right?
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Welcome. Very quickly, let me format this and right click and show values as. There's a concept called running totals. I can go ahead and add that as here as well. So at a subcategory level, I can see the running totals wherein the last value and the total value is going to be exactly the same. It makes more sense to see running totals at a date level. So let me just show that to you. Let me just show running totals at a date level and let me zoom in, right click, add another column for sales, right click on the next column, show values as, and choose running total. And I want to have running total at a month level. And if you see at a month level, it is going to add up for that specific year. So my first value is going to be exactly the same, but my next value is going to be a little different. My next value, thank you for too fast, but then there's no way you can complete this much in just 1 hour. Yes, Ramdas, the idea was just to give an overview of what all pivot tables can offer. I know it was very fast, but that is because someone who's never worked on pivot tables, at least now they have an idea of what the pivot tables are. Someone who's already worked on pivot tables, now they get a fair understanding of how they can work on pivot tables or what, or if they've learned something new, right? Yes, you're welcome. One last thing that I want to show you guys. So in terms of running total, then you have a percent of running total as well at a month level. So this very clearly tells you that by October, I had reached 72% of my sales numbers. By October, I had reached 72% of my sales numbers. One last thing that I want to show you in the grouping that I created. This is the last topic for the day. And okay. So now when from this data set itself, when I create a new pivot table, I do Alt and VT, existing sheet, and let's say I want to create a pivot table here. I press OK. Now, let's say I want to add my quantity grouping. I want to add my quantity, but I don't want to have it as a bin, right? But it is going to come as a bin every time I create a new pivot table. If I ungroup, it's going to ungroup from all the pivot tables. I don't want that to happen. So how do I create a pivot table with a new cache? So what you have to do is you have to press Alt DP. Alt DP. This is how you would do it in Excel 2003 or prior. Excel 2003 or prior. Microsoft Excel list, pivot table, next. And this is your range. And where do you want the pivot table to be created? Right? Existing worksheet created here. Finish. It'll create the pivot table here. And now when I add quantity or sales, it is not going to have them grouped. It shouldn't have them grouped. Right click, ungroup, and is ungrouping everything. 1 second. Alt DP. Next. This is my data set. Next. If you click no, I clicked on yes earlier. I want to click on no because I want to create a new pivot table with a fresh cache. And I click on finish. And now when I add my sum of sales in rows, sum of sales is grouped here, as you can see, but here it will be ungrouped. Similarly, if I add my quantity is going to be grouped in this table in the earlier pivot tables, but this is a new pivot table with a new cache, right? So if you want to maintain the old groupings, but you also want to have do not want to have a grouping in a different report view, you will press Alt DP to create the pivot table. Alt DP is the shortcut to create the pivot table, right? That is all I had. I had a few more examples, but we are short on time. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Happy to answer any questions anyone has, right? I'll share the file and the recording, right? I'll plan maybe a longer session on pivot tables, right? Like Ramdas mentioned that this was a bit too fast paced, but that was the idea, just to give you a run through of everything that a pivot table has to offer. I still not covered everything, right? There are a lot of other things, calculations and many more aggregations and formulations that you can do, and I've not covered those for now. But in case anyone has any questions, do let me know. Happy to answer, or we can go ahead and wind up the call. You're welcome, Ramdas. You're welcome, Ganesh. Yeah, see you. Great then. In case anyone, no one has any questions, we can go ahead and wind up the call. Thank you, Rishabh. Thank you everyone for joining and staying through the entire hour. Right, I'll share the recording by tomorrow or day after tomorrow, along with the files and the presentation as well. Thank you.